Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're looking into something really interesting, the connection between music and medicine back in the early modern period.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Not just music as entertainment, but as something that could, well, genuinely affect your health.
Right. Seen as both a cause of sickness and, maybe surprisingly, a cure, and also as a kind of model for understanding ourselves, body, mind, soul, the whole package.
Exactly.
So our mission here is to unpack those ideas. How did they think music worked medically? How did it help explain, the human condition? We want to make it clear, engaging, without drowning you in detail.
Okay, let's dive in.
So this dual role you mentioned, remedy and cause, how did that work?
Well, a lot of it tied into how they understood illness itself, especially things related to the passions of the mind.
Like melancholy.
Melancholy, yes, that was a big one in the 16th, 17th centuries. Think deep sadness, what we might call depression now. And later in the 18th century, you see more focus on nervous disorders.
And they saw these as directly linked to physical health.
Absolutely. The mind and body weren't seen as so separate. So music, because it clearly affects emotions, was thought to be a powerful tool for influencing these passions.
Okay. And that affected the body's spirits and humors?
Precisely. That was the dominant framework. Music could potentially rebalance things.
And Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, that fits right in here, doesn't it?
Oh, massively. It's a cornerstone text. Burton goes deep into melancholy and explicitly discusses music's role, both good and bad.
And what about those dancing diseases? Parentism, St. Vitus's dance.
Right. Those are really curious cases. Music seems to have had this very ambiguous role.
How so?
It was thought that certain music could actually trigger the frantic dancing, the mania.
Wow.
But then specific types of music were also used as the cure to somehow regulate or exhaust the condition. So stimulus and remedy.
That really shows how complex they thought the relationship was. It wasn't straightforward.
Not at all. And you see a similar idea, maybe more controlled, in court entertainments. Masks, ballets, opera.
They weren't just for fun.
Well, yes, fun too, but they often carried this underlying message about harmony. The structured nature of the music and performance was meant to represent, and maybe even encourage, the taming of wilder emotions or passions.
So music could actively shape your inner state. That's a powerful idea.
Definitely.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The material suggests music was also used as a model, almost like an explanatory tool for things harder to grasp, like the mind-body-soul connection.
Yes, that's another key aspect. How do you explain these invisible connections? Music offered analogies.
What kind of analogies?
Two main ones pop up. One focuses on the action of spirits.
Not ghosts, right?
No, more like subtle active vapors or fluids flowing through the body, connecting things. And the second analogy was vibrating musical strings.
Okay, the spirits idea makes a certain kind of sense in their context. But vibrating strings, how did that explain the body or soul?
It connects to the concept of sympathy, this idea that things in the universe and within us have affinities. They can influence each other even at a distance.
Like resonance.
Exactly like resonance. That was the prime example. You pluck a lute string.
And another one nearby vibrates if it's tuned the same. I've seen that.
Right. So that physical phenomenon became a model for how, say, emotions could affect the body, or how the soul and body interacted. It was all about shared vibrations, maintained by tonos, a kind of spiritual tension. It's rooted in Neoplatonism, this idea of an interconnected cosmos.
And the lute was a common instrument, so people would get the analogy.
Precisely. And some figures, like Robert Flood, even created diagrams based on this.
Oh yes, Flood. What did his diagrams show?
Really striking images. He had his divine monochord, basically a single string representing the entire structure of the universe, from God down to the material world, all divided according to musical ratios. Musica mundana.
The music of the spheres. Visualize.
Exactly. And then he'd depict the human being, the microcosm, with a similar string representing the connection between soul and body, linked to those medical spirits we mentioned. The whole universe, and us within it, conceived in musical terms.
That single-string metaphor is powerful, connecting the cosmic and the personal.
It really is, and it's fascinating how these core ideas, harmony, vibration, sympathy, persisted, even when the scientific language changed later to mechanics or chemistry. The underlying model was resilient.
A really enduring way of thinking. Now, you mentioned Neoplatonism. A key figure there seems to be Marsilio Ficino. His De Triplici Vita comes out.
Ficino is absolutely central, especially for the 15th century onwards. His 3 books on life was hugely influential. It wasn't just abstract philosophy. It was meant as practical advice for scholars on staying healthy mentally and physically.
And what was his big contribution regarding music?
He offered a new theory for how music affects us so deeply. He connected the actual physical movement of air by music
The sound waves?
to the movement of the human spirit, our internal air or pneuma. And crucially, he linked that to the spiritus mundi, the world spirit.
Whoa. So music literally moves this subtle energy that connects us to the cosmos.
That was his idea. It provided a mechanism, a philosophical justification for music's power over emotions and health, linking it to astrology and natural magic. Music could draw down celestial influences via this shared spiritus.
That's quite a concept. How widely did these ideas spread? Was Ficino widely read?
Maybe not Ficino directly by everyone, but his ideas definitely filtered down. They were picked up and popularized in other works, like Agrippa's De Occulta Philosophia.
Ah, okay, so it entered the sort of general intellectual current.
Yes, and you see echoes in Burton centuries later and in Kircher's musical encyclopedia. Even writers who don't explicitly name Ficino seem to be drawing on this well of ideas about music, air, spirit, and nerves.
Like Brown's Medicina Musica.
Exactly. Or Brocklesby, even later, explicitly citing Ficino when discussing music's effect on animal spirits in mental disorders.
So if Ficino cast a long shadow, his framework really stuck.
It provided a powerful language for talking about these connections.
Okay, let's zoom in on the medical side more directly. You mentioned the distinction between medicine and physics. Can you remind us?
Sure. It's important. Medicine was often more the hands-on treatment surgery, giving remedies. You didn't always need a university degree for that.
More practical.
Right. Physics, on the other hand, was the university subject. Theoretical, based on natural philosophy, trying to understand the why behind health and disease.
And that was dominated by Galen's ideas.
Largely, yes. The Galenic system. Health as a balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, choler, and black bile, melancholy.
Influenced by the elements hot, cold, wet, dry.
Exactly. And the key wasn't just curing disease, but maintaining that balance. Prevention was huge.
Which leads to the non-naturals.
Yes, the 6 non-naturals. Things you could control. The air you breathe, food and drink, sleep, exercise, evacuation, and crucially, the passions of the mind, your emotions. Regulating these was seen as fundamental to health.
And where does music fit into that Galenic picture?
Well, in several ways. Singing, for instance, could be seen as a form of exercise, good for circulation, potentially rebalancing humors.
Okay, makes sense.
Physicians also use musical rhythm, believe it or not, to help assess a patient's pulse, comparing pulse rhythms to musical meters.
That's specific.
Isn't it? And listening to music was generally seen as beneficial. Good for digestion, helpful during labor, good for relaxation.
So, general wellness benefits.
Yes, but the strongest connection, as we've said, was with the passions. Because emotions were thought to directly impact the humors and spirits, music's ability to sway emotions made it a potential tool for directly influencing that internal balance.
So, within the main medical theory of the day, music had a legitimate therapeutic role, especially regarding emotions.
Definitely. It wasn't fringe, it fit the system.
Let's go back to melancholy then. How exactly did they think it worked pathologically?
The basic idea was an excess, or maybe a corruption, of black bile. This bad, melancholy humor could then sort of thicken or disrupt the flow of other bodily fluids and, importantly, the spirits.
The spirits again.
Yeah.
How are they understood in relation to the brain and body?
Burton gives a good summary. The body had 3 main cavities: head, chest, abdomen. The brain in the head was the seat of reason. It received vital spirits from the heart, refined them into animal spirits,
Animal spirits.
which were thought to be these incredibly fine, quick substances that flowed through the nerves, enabling sensation and motion.
And they were stored somewhere.
In the ventricles of the brain, these hollow spaces, different ventricles were linked to different faculties: common sense, imagination, reason, memory, a very different picture of the brain than we have now.
Absolutely. And emotions, the passions, where do they fit?
Linked mainly to the heart and the flow of those animal spirits. Pleasure made the spirits flow outwards from the brain to the heart, expanding it. Pain or sadness did the opposite spirits retreated. The heart contracted. Melancholy blood might gather around it.
A very dynamic, almost hydraulic system.
In a way, yes. And hearing music, the idea was either the vibrating air was directly taken in by the spirits around the heart, or that the mind itself, being somehow harmonically structured, resonated with the music.
Fascinating attempts to connect sound, feeling, and physiology. Now, how did these ideas evolve as science moved towards, say, mechanics and experimental philosophy?
You see figures trying to translate the older concepts. George Chain is a good example. He initially used Newtonian mechanics, trying to explain the body as a kind of machine.
But he still used older concepts.
Yes, analogy remained important. He still talked about spiritus, sometimes linking it to Newton's idea of an aether. The underlying principle of harmony and balance persisted, just explained in new terms.
And Chain had that musical analogy for the soul and body.
He did. The soul and the brain like a musician, the body as the instrument. Health meant the instrument was well-tuned. He even connected the physical property of nerve elasticity to how sensitive or imaginative a person was.
The body as an instrument, and Genti too.
Genti also saw nerves as instruments, comparing them to solid strings or fluid-filled pipes, trying to explain sensation and motion using physics, vibration, mathematical ratios.
So the metaphors shifted towards physics, but the core idea of music relating to the body's function and the emotions remained strong.
Absolutely. Through all these shifts, from Ficino in the 15th century right through to the 18th, that fundamental link between music, spirits, passions, and health remains remarkably consistent.
Okay, let's bring in Dubartas, a poet, very popular. How does he fit into this picture of music and harmony?
Dubartas is fascinating because he really embodies this worldview where music and poetry are central. His big work, Les Semaines, The Weeks, reflects this sense of cosmic order, drawing heavily on Platonism and the idea of harmony.
Harmony as an antidote to chaos.
Pretty much. He uses the idea of concordia discourse harmony arising from seeming opposites. The creation itself is seen as a musical event, reflecting the harmony of the spheres.
And the poet's role.
For Dubartas, the poet is almost a divine agent, someone who can help restore the harmony lost after the fall of man. He compares the poet's lyre to those of Orpheus and King David.
Mythical and biblical figures known for music's power.
Exactly. He connects the biblical idea of God creating the world by number, weight, and measure to poetic creation and musical harmony. The poet wields these same principles.
So the poet isn't just describing harmony, but actively creating it.
That's the claim. He explicitly aligns his own poetry with the power of Orpheus to tame nature, or David to soothe Saul. His verse is presented as having this almost magical, harmonizing effect.
Reconnecting humanity with the divine, bridging earth and heaven again.
That's the ambition, yes. His muse is linked to the celestial harmonies. He paints this picture of Eden where birds sang with angels and poets sang like Orpheus. The poet, through verse, could regain some of that original power, that harmony.
That's a powerful vision for poetry. How did he explain how music, like David's, could have such a profound effect, say, on Saul's troubled mind?
He draws on those Neoplatonic ideas again, musica humana. The harmony within the human soul is defined numerically, just like cosmic harmony, musica mundana.
Numbers again.
Yes. He talks about Jubal-Cain, the biblical inventor of music, having a numbery soul. The soul itself is conceived as having this inherent mathematical musical structure, perhaps imprinted even before birth.
So music works because it resonates with that inner numerical harmony.
Exactly. Poetic song with its rhythm and measure, number, weight, and measure, acts like a tuning fork, bringing the soul's harmony back into alignment. Or like a seal impressing wax, it imposes its harmonious pattern.
And this numerical basis is the secret to its power.
That's what Dubartas suggests. It's why music can conquer stubborn things, influence emotions so strongly. Think of Timotheus riling up Alexander the Great with music. It taps into this fundamental mathematical order of the universe and the soul.
A deep correspondence between the big picture and the individuals.
Precisely. Macrocosm and microcosm, linked by number and harmony.
And this power even extends to the divine. The idea that hymns could calm God.
That belief existed, yes. It implies even the divine might be understood in these harmonious, perhaps numerical terms. It all reinforces why music was taken so seriously, even in, say, a clinical context. The philosophical and theological ideas supported its perceived power.
Which brings us nicely to lovesickness. Music as a treatment there.
Yes, this was a very common application, or at least recommendation. Lovesickness was considered a genuine malady.
Not just teenage angst.
No, a serious disorder with real physical and mental symptoms, discussed since ancient times. By the Middle Ages, it was often framed as a form of melancholy, a cognitive problem where obsessive thoughts disrupt the body's balance.
And music was a go-to treatment.
It was frequently recommended, alongside other things like distractions, good food, baths. Music was seen as particularly good at soothing the mind and, crucially, reharmonizing the body and soul thrown out of whack by love.
Why music specifically? What was the theory?
Well, it links back to everything we've discussed. Music's connection to universal harmony, its known power over emotions. There was also perhaps a perceived similarity between love and music. Both are kind of invisible forces with tangible effects. Both could feel almost divine or magical.
Bridging the material and immaterial.
Exactly. And you had centuries of thought, biblical examples like David, classical ones, church fathers, Boethius, all affirming music's power to heal, soothe, or inspire. Audible music, musica instrumentalis, could restore internal balance through sympathetic action.
Was this just theoretical, or was music actually used medically?
Well, music was part of the liberal arts, so educated people, including future physicians, would have studied its theory. There's evidence of musical practice in universities, and some physicians owned instruments.
But were they prescribing specific songs for lovesickness?
Specific prescriptions are rare. The recommendations often seem more based on general principles from books rather than detailed case notes. But the idea was certainly there. Music could soothe the lover's pain.
Though sometimes it could also stir things up.
Yes, that's the other side of the coin. Music's power was ambiguous. Just as it could soothe love pangs, it could also arouse amorous feelings. Think Orpheus again, or Ovid recommending music to enervate the mind against love's struggles.
So a double-edged sword.
A bit, yes. Medieval advice often suggested music alongside things like wine and pleasant company to lift the spirits of the lovesick.
And culturally, music became deeply associated with love and courtship.
Oh, definitely. Music was seen as the food of love, something that attracts lovers. Think Castiglione's courtier. It was used in marriage rites, played in gardens known for romance.
Instruments became symbols of love.
Very much so. Songs and instruments could dispel melancholy, but also signify romantic availability or skill. Burton even quotes Erasmus, saying lovers should learn to play instruments. There are emblems showing Venus making a lover musical.
So musical therapy for love became almost a kind of self-help trend.
You could say that. It entered the cultural mainstream. Instruments, music books, paintings depicting musical scenes, they all became part of the landscape of courtship and managing emotions. They were almost like cultural pills for love's imbalances.
And images reinforced this.
Absolutely. Visuals constantly repeated the theme of music's power in love, both to incite and to cure. Female musicians in particular were often depicted as holding this power.
Interesting. And instruments themselves might carry messages.
Yes, lute tutors mention music's value in courtship. Instruments were often decorated with relevant imagery, erotic scenes, or symbols of solace. Keyboard instruments sometimes had mottos explicitly referring to music's healing powers for the mind or sorrow.
Music literally inscribed with its own therapeutic promise.
Exactly. It permeated the culture.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up. Thinking back over everything, what are the main takeaways for you from this deep dive into music and medicine?
For me, it's just how deeply intertwined they were. Music wasn't peripheral. It was seen as a fundamental force, a tool for healing things like lovesickness, yes, but also a key model for understanding ourselves, our place in the cosmos, that whole body-mind-spirit connection.
A very holistic view, in a way.
In a very specific, early modern way, yes.
And what stands out as particularly striking or maybe surprising?
I think the sheer persistence of these core ideas, harmony, spirit, sympathy across centuries, even as scientific language changed. Also, the use of those musical analogies like Flood's monochord or Chain's body as instrument. And while the belief that music could influence the divine, that's quite something. Plus, how music became this accepted, almost expected remedy for the pangs of love.
Absolutely. And hopefully for you listening, this deep dive has given you a clear, structured look at this complex history without feeling overwhelming.
We hope so.
So, a final thought to leave you with. Reflecting on this history, how does our modern use of music for well-being, music therapy, playlists for moods, etc. compare? Are we tapping into similar ideas, perhaps without the same philosophical framework? What hidden powers of music might we still be rediscovering, or perhaps understanding in new ways?
Lots to think about there.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.